I'm Andrea Volpe. I'm the Director of the Council for the Arts at MIT, and it's my pleasure to welcome you this afternoon to today's conversation, which will ask, and we hope offer us some answers to the question, how is generative AI transforming art and design? I'd like to especially acknowledge members and guests of the Council for the Arts at MIT who are here today for their annual meeting, as well as members of the MIT Club of Boston. Today's program is co-presented by the Council for the Arts and the Center for Art, Science, and Technology. The Council was founded in 1972 by MIT President Jerome B. Wiesner to support the arts at MIT, made up of our alumni and friends of the Institute. Council members champion and help advance the arts as they're practiced across the Institute. The MIT Center for Art, Culture, and Technology, or as it's known here by its MIT acronym CAST, was established in 2012 as a joint initiative by Philip S. Corey, Vice Provost of the Arts, and the Deans of the Schools of Architecture and Planning and the School of Arts, Humanities, and the Social Sciences. CAST's mission is to create new opportunities for art, science, and technology to thrive as interrelated, mutually informing modes of exploration, knowledge, and discovery. The projects CAST supports and presents take many forms, including boundary-crossing research by faculty, collaborative work with visiting artists, cross-disciplinary classes, performances, installations, symposia, and publications. I'd also like to thank Evan Ziporn, Kennan Distinguished Professor and CAST's Faculty Director, and Leela W. Kinney, CAST's Executive Director, who also serves as Executive Director of Arts Initiatives, for their partnership in presenting today's conversation. I'd also like to thank Janet Plotkin, Chair of the Council's Annual Meeting and Program Committee, for encouraging us to consider today's very timely topic. The entire Arts Initiative production team, led ably by my colleague, Catherine Higgins, who's made everything here today possible, and Lisa Custer, VP of Communications for MIT's Club of Boston, for helping spread the word with our alumni. In a moment, I'll introduce the panel, but before that, a few words about the format of today's conversation. We'll begin with our moderator, Onur Yüce Gün, posing a series of questions in conversation with our panelists. After they've had an initial opportunity to discuss and respond to these questions, we'll open things up for questions from the audience to continue the conversation. To ask your question, please line up before one of the standing mics. And if you're in the middle of a row, we also will have a roving mic. Please wait for the mic to reach you before you ask your question. So with that, I'd like to introduce our speakers today. Our moderator, Onur Yüce Gün, earned a master's degree in design and computation and a PhD in computation with a minor in media, arts, and sciences at MIT. He's been recognized by TEDx and Time Magazine's Best Invention lists, and his work has been exhibited internationally, including at AIA New York, the Center for Architecture, the Centre Pompidou in Paris, and Gallery A4 in Tokyo. Onur is the Director of Computational Design at New Balance, where he develops end-to-end computational design workflows and futuristic concepts. Ziv Epstein earned his PhD at MIT last year in 2023 and is now a postdoctoral fellow at the Stanford Institute for Human-Centered AI. In his research, he seeks to bring a more than human-centered approach to the design of socio-technological systems. In particular, he focuses on translating insights from design and social sciences into the development of generative AI and social media platforms. He has published widely in scholarly and public interest journals, and he's also a practicing multimedia artist whose work has been featured at Ars Electronica, the MIT Museum, and Burning Man. Anna Miljački is a curator, critic, and professor of architecture at MIT. She teaches history, theory, and design, and directs the Master of Science in Architecture Studies and the Master of Science in Architecture Studies architectural design programs. Her research interests range from the role of architecture and architects in Cold War Eastern Europe to the theories of postmodernism and late socialism and the politics of contemporary architectural production. In 2018, she founded the Critical Broadcasting Lab to engage in critical curatorial and broadcasting work. Her AI video installation, The Pilgrimage, is currently exhibited as part of Time, Space, Existence, presented by the European Cultural Center during the 2023 Venice Architectural Biennale, which closes in late November. Artist and roboticist Alex Reben earned his master's degree from the Media Lab in 2010. For over a decade, he has worked closely with cutting-edge technology and companies, developing artwork spanning multiple medium. His solo exhibit, AI-MI, Artificial Intelligence as Generated by Alexander Reben, is on exhibit at the Crocker Museum in Sacramento through April 2024. He also has a show at the Bitforms Gallery in New York that's up through the weekend. And congratulations, Alex, for recently being named as OpenAI's first artist in residence. I'd like to invite Anna to the podium to have a presentation of her work, followed by the other panelists, and then we'll go to conversation. Thank you.
So let me begin. We have 5 minutes for these presentations, so I hope I can tell you a little bit of what we've been doing in architecture. So I'm, as you heard, a professor of architecture at MIT and also director of the Critical Broadcasting Lab, where I've been working with amazing architecture students, especially Aus Aburaz, who is here in the audience, on some of this work with AI. He's enabled the engagement with generative AI for us and for the questions in the lab. So the first, and also, without CAST, we couldn't do any of it. So CAST has been a really important supporter of this work. In the Critical Broadcasting Lab, we were interested in starting a kind of a large umbrella project that we thought of as bootleg futures, of which the pilgrimage is a part of. And these are a couple of images of some of the pilgrimage that I will show you a little bit more of. But the key idea with bootleg futures was that we would use AI to help us produce commentary on architecture culture, and possibly on the use of AI in architecture. So the idea was that we would, in a way, produce things that we thought of as mirrors, friction, decoys, that we would feed back into the data stream of architecture culture, such that any future AI that came behind us would have to contend with those as they scraped that data. But then in 2022, in the summer, a memorial cemetery in Mostar was destroyed, and for me this was important. There have been many such memorials in Yugoslavia, built in the kind of aftermath of the Second World War. Really, most of them were built in the 60s and 70s to wire a generation of citizens of Yugoslavia for brotherhood, unity, and anti-fascism. And as kids, we, as I'm one of those citizens, were taken around the different memorials across the territory of Yugoslavia, collectively on buses to experience them, to hear about these sites, which were sites of massive atrocities, and to walk away with experiences, collective experiences of seeing them. So when that memorial was destroyed in 2022, I felt like it would be important to actually figure out a way or respond by upholding the values that those memorials were for. We were wondering if AI could help us produce an aesthetic experience out of some of this material that would actually manage to produce a kind of a pushback at the vandalism, which is now symptomatic across different nations that emerged out of Yugoslavia. So using material like this that is from official archives, as well as material like this that you might know better from Instagram and elsewhere on the internet, which often includes selfies in front of killing fields, which we skipped in the process of this particular project, but basically using that sort of vast array of images that are indexes of actual visits to these sites. We trained a generative adversarial network, a style GAN3. These became available widely in 21 to produce models out of them, and then we interpolated videos of 6 different monuments, which we present to you as a kind of synthetic memory of visits that we want to seed for those who have not actually had the memories, like my generation of Yugoslavian citizens. The material is held together with a kind of a non-linear documentary soundscape whose silences as well as sounds are derived from the soundscape of Yugoslavia that those monuments belong to. So this is currently on view at Palazzo Mora in Venice at the European Cultural Center. And we are hoping that we're currently developing 3 more monument videos, and we're hoping that eventually we can also produce something that is a more spatial sort of experience of this. Currently, it is a triptych of videos playing at one moment. So I'm asking you to imagine it in an industrial large space where you get to walk through these for a while and sit with them and think about what they represent and maybe absorb some of that. So that's my presentation in 5 minutes.
We're good? Great. All right. Amazing. Hi, everyone. I'm Ziv. I just defended at the Media Lab over there in April. Now live in California, where I'm a postdoctoral fellow at the Institute for Human-Centered AI at Stanford. And it's my first time being back. It's really good to be back and see all these amazing faces. So, at least for me, AI is constantly evolving, and my relationship to it has been evolving this whole time. And in order to kind of understand it, I've had to play with it. And in playing with it, it's kind of shaped the way I think about it, both as a social scientist, but also as a multimedia artist. So I'm going to give you kind of a taste of some of the work that we've kind of done and kind of thinking about going forward. And given that it's Halloween, I figured I would start with something a little spooky that has actually explored spirituality. So this is a body of work called AI Seance, where in collaboration with some folks from the Harvard Divinity School, we actually staged an AI seance where we had Stable Diffusion on the table, and we're kind of prompting it to kind of imagine what possibilities could be conjured. And we kind of do this repeatedly, get images, and then with some friends, we basically generate on top of this to kind of imagine what it was like to kind of be in that room. And the idea here is to kind of use AI as a device to evoke creativity and community and kind of imagine these kind of alternative ways of doing this with these kind of like alternative perspectives kind of embedded in this process. We've also done this kind of work exploring creativity here at the Media Lab. So this was earlier, right after the pandemic, at the Media Lab, trying to imagine the kind of the future and various possibilities. We basically had friends and colleagues pair up into pairs, and we had all these kind of topics such as space or fashion or transportation or oceans, and kind of imagine how the world could be better at the intersection of these things. So these kind of nascent visions of a future utopia. They would take their kind of collaborative visions and then plant them in this solar punk seed vault garden. So these are all these kind of radical ideas of what the future could kind of look like. And here's one example, to dye the ocean purple to prevent global warming. Interesting idea. What we then did is we used these seeds to basically feed them into generative AI to kind of imagine what these futures might actually look like. So here's some kind of examples. We have dyeing the ocean purple to prevent global warming, holistic traditional medicine as an art form, biophilic vertical gardens lining neighborhood roads, creating function and beautiful public spaces, and finally public spaces, solidarity building, the intersection of oceans and relationships, public accessible oceanic vistas. We then showed these back to the people who created them and said, does this line up with what you kind of had in mind a little bit? And it turns out this actually led to two interesting things. The first is it gave people implementation ideas of how their future might actually work. So for example, the person who had the idea of the biophilic vertical gardens was really surprised to not see any pumps or tubes, and that was just stuff kind of growing on the street. And I was like, wow, that's kind of interesting. We also found that it sparked lateral thinking and bringing in new concepts that they hadn't really thought about. So for example, here, with the public spaces and solidarity building, the person was very surprised that this image doesn't have any oceans in it. There's no water, even though it literally says oceans twice. However, there's all these people kind of banding together, and this kind of made them realize the importance of relationship building and community in public space. So this kind of highlights that there's a lot of, I think, and many people might agree, like possibilities for creativity with these tools. But there's also monsters here, right? And I hope we get to discuss this. And one of those is who gets credit for AI-generated art? Because it's such a complicated, diffuse socio-technical systems. How do we kind of think about credit and ownership with these kind of models? So to explore this, we ran a controlled randomized study where we basically showed people a vignette, a story of how AI is generated. Half of the people read it as AI as a tool, so it's a fancy Photoshop, and the artist is kind of using this fancy Photoshop. The other half saw AI as an agent with its own belief and intent, and it's the one kind of making the art. Then we asked people across a wide variety of different actors, so the crowd, the people whose data and images are in the AI, the technologist, the person training and making this AI, the artist, the one kind of playing with it, the curator, the one kind of figuring out, okay, where does it go? And then finally the AI itself. How do they allocate responsibility to all these people depending on if it's perceived and framed as a tool or an agent? And what we see is actually pretty striking. For the artist here, you see that when you anthropomorphize the AI, so that's this blue relative to the orange, it actually decreases perceived credit and responsibility to the human that was actually making the work. And at the same time, it actually increases perceived credit and responsibility to the technologist, the one who made the tool that this work was created. So this kind of suggests that the way we talk about AI really matters. It's not pedantic. It actually has material consequences. And if you anthropomorphize it, it can actually undermine credit and responsibility to the humans, and that can be swept under the rug and really benefit the technologists and these technology companies. So this, I think, kind of led the way to these kind of broader questions of how we think about and talk about AI. So earlier this year, we collaborated with 14 interdisciplinary authors and posted an article in Science magazine kind of outlining the societal impact of generative AI. And basically there, we kind of trace many different phases of generative AI. So starting from these, what's the inputs to these systems? So attribution and training data. And these are the legal questions of attribution and ownership, working with people at Harvard Law School. Then, okay, once you have the trained model, what are people doing with it? How is this going to change aesthetics and culture? But then also, what's the kind of labor economics of creative work? So then, how is it changing? Who gets jobs? How is creative work functioning? And then finally, the downstream impacts on our media and information environments. So this is how do we kind of, in the face of deepfakes and the explosion of AI-generated content, how do we kind of develop trustworthy media? And then, kind of looking forward a little bit, I'm really interested in kind of using AI to shift human attention, intention, and perception, and kind of really root it in place. So this summer, we were above the Arctic Circle in Svalbard, kind of doing post-human fieldwork, and essentially trying to explore how we can use AI to kind of explore divergent ontologies for science, and what are these kind of possibilities for reframing how we do science and build AI. So thanks, and that's me.
Hi, everybody. Can you hear me? Great. So the year was 2020, and I was stuck in my studio because of COVID. Couldn't leave, couldn't collaborate with people. And I found this unexpected collaborator, this weird thing called GPT that I had beta access to at the time. And I was going back and forth with it, playing with it in different ways, and I thought it might be interesting to have it generate ideas for things that didn't exist. And one way to generate ideas is through text descriptions. So I got it to generate descriptions of wall labels like you would see in a museum. So this is the result of one of those wall labels. So the idea I had was to have it generate ideas, and then I would try to fabricate them myself. So these plungers is that. Here's the description. Again, this is early GPT generated. The sculpture contains a plunger, a toilet plunger, a plunger, a plunger, a plunger, and a plunger, each of which has been modified. The first plunger is simply a normal plunger, but the rest represent a series of plungers with more and more of the handle removed. The title of the artwork is A Short History of Plungers and Other Things That Go Plunge in the Night by the artist known as the Plungers, whose identity remains unknown. And it actually goes in and talk about how they started a movement in the 70s called Plungism, and that was like a whole thing in New York. So yeah, there was something really fun and interesting here and strange. So I've been digging into this since 2020. Here is a description around my museum show. There are lots of empty walls in the museum, so I filled those with wall label descriptions for artworks which are nothing. And this one describes it as, in art speak, daringly venturing into the farthest frontiers of aesthetic deconstruction. The artist behind Ex Nihilo, a study in the ineffable minimalism of the non-object, tenaciously challenges the conventional confines of form and materiality. And it goes on. It's not crafted from paint, marble, or bronze, but from the cosmos's most fundamental element, absence itself. And then it goes on and on and on and on and on, as we might. Yeah, so it's really fun. Other things I've done with it is point GPT vision on artworks that I make, and then it makes labels justifying why I made the artworks and sort of describing what they're about, which is also fun. What you're about to see here is a GPT describe wall label was turned into text to image, right? Because once DALL-E came out, that was the next logical step. That image is then taken and turned into a real artwork. So this will show the process. Here's the DALL-E out-painted image that came from a description from GPT. That is 3D modeled, so turned into a 3D object. That is then 3D printed in real size. The foundry I work with does lost 3D print casting. So this is them pouring bronze in the traditional format. Again, pouring that in, and it sort of melts the 3D model out from there. These guys are real professionals. It was made in 3 pieces, so then someone has to go in there and weld it together, which is an art form in its own. As you can see, the kind of top feather type thing is missing. Also, interestingly, it's hollow, which I didn't know of bronze sculptures till I got into it. So there it is, nice and shiny, which they don't stay. So then you got a patina artist comes in with fire and acid and turns it into its final product. There you go, you can see him going through the process real quick there. There are actually several steps to this, and they finish it with floor wax, which is kind of interesting. So here's the final object, which is going to last forever and is now in the permanent collection of the Crocker. Part of why I show this video is just to show how many humans are involved in the creation of this AI artwork at the end of the day. So yeah, working with bronze, I've been working with every sort of medium I found interesting as well. So we have stained glass in the show. We had performance art, which was everything from a teenager looking at their phone ignoring everyone to people playing Jenga, again with AI justifying those works. But also have marble sculptures made by robots. So again, the same process, image made by AI, that comes into a 3D model. But in this case, instead of 3D printing, there's a robot that carves it. But also, interestingly, humans actually need to get in by hand afterwards because there's only so much detail that the robot can do. And here it is at the museum show. And it's pretty nifty. So here's some shots from that show. And to end off quick, this is like a super quick social media thing of me running around, but just give you an idea of how some of these things are laid out. There's everything from, there's the stained glass. There's everything from robot-made oil painting from out-painted images, which this is, to things which are interactive. So there's also a podium you can go up to, speak anything you imagine, and it turns that into an image and combines your image with every other image everyone's made over time into a never-ending artwork. I think my favorite thing in the show, perhaps, is, I think we'll see it on the wall if it didn't pop up already, is a split flap display like you used to see in train stations with letters. So every minute, GPT generates a criticism of the show that's never ending, and it just keeps criticizing the show in real time. There it is, yeah, just saying how awful AI art is and how the show is useless. So anyway, I'll pause it here because you should go visit this in person. Thank you.
Wonderful presentations. Thank you very much for that, and thank you for everybody to be here tonight. We have been hearing about AI a lot for the last, I would say, maybe 18 months to 3 years. Things started before that. Many people at MIT already know that, right? So it's much older than that. Today, the reason for us to get together is to see if generative AI has real transforming effect on arts, and if we can answer some questions about how this tool can be utilized in an interesting way. So I think that the point is that the technology affected art always in some ways, and AI is not the exception. So we have 3 questions. What we're going to do is I'm going to ask 3 questions. Surprise, surprise, right? And I would expect everybody to kind of respond to that. And I think we will go back to the presentations. That was super useful for everybody to see. My first question is about emergence and ambiguity. So I like giving these keywords because when I talk too much, it's hard to follow. So I'll start with emergence and ambiguity. Those are the 2 keywords. And just looking at your work, all of your work, actually the emergence is there's a question, but the question is ambiguous by nature, and the answer is kind of like found on the road. And the final thing maybe even is still not the answer yet, right? I think that's very inherent to the processes of like design and creating artwork. And the question here is that, do you think playing with AI is truly generating those ambiguities? Is it making your search in ambiguity rich? Or are you still kind of tracing some synthetic origins as you explore? Are there some limitations that you have to kind of like, deal with, which is not maybe ambiguous enough? So what are the potentials and limitations on that? That's the question. I'd like to start with you because you are number one now. So.
Really? Okay, so I know you're emphasizing ambiguity now, but when I first read the questions, I was thinking about really the kinds of things that the discussion that I had in a very different context about how we use AI to, do we think of it in the production of sort of scientific knowledge as a co-author? Do we credit it? Do we use it? Or how do we use it for the production of indexing in books, etc.? And in that context, I was finding it a really problematic sort of, I'm going to call it tool. Sure. I'm on that side, I think.
Yeah.
And for me, that was like basically putting it into a context where it had to, the ways in which it produces the material, which is probabilistic and algorithmic, doesn't quite, for me, square against the kind of production of scientific knowledge and its standards. In the context in which I use it, or we have been playing with it, what's great about it is that it hallucinates. So the things that are problematic in the production of scientific knowledge become really, I think, an interesting potential in the production of aesthetic outcomes and maybe critique. And so this is precisely the kind of, maybe this is how you mean ambiguity, but the fact that it's sort of, in our case, is able to produce a multidimensional model out of which it outputs something, that enables the kind of work that we couldn't necessarily do at our desks or in our heads. But I'm definitely interested in producing cohesion, if that's a question, and maybe that was obvious in the videos that we were producing. So for me, it is our capacity to coax it to produce a very specific kind of aesthetic outcome and experience that I found fascinating and, exciting. That's maybe
Amazing.
the thing that I want to put on the table, that I got very scared of Zv's way of using it in the questions, that I was like, well, this is what architects do. Don't, but we can go there later.
Ziv, do you want to take it from there?
Sure, yeah, that sounds great. Yeah, so I think I was really intrigued by this notion of a tool, and obviously since AI is a complicated thing, one thing even, so when we were writing this paper with 14 people, we even a lot of people let's not even call it AI. Like, what even is AI? Like, it's kind of just human stupidity, you know? So I think trying to understand and pin down what this is, and we oftentimes have to rely on metaphors because it's such a complicated thing that we have to try to pin it down. And I kind of agree that tool is maybe a good one, and a lot of people aren't even on that page. A lot of people think it is an agent or something else, and I think there is a lot of benefit in thinking about it as a tool. Ultimately, though, these are all metaphors, and they have benefits and they have downsides. So, full disclosure, on our paper, there were some authors there from Adobe, and Adobe makes AI tools. So that kind of metaphor works for them. There are other companies that make these technologies that have other metaphors that they use, and those cut along lines of power. So I think when we talk about what metaphors and what tools we work, that's an important one. But I also think it's important to note that tools aren't neutral. I think that's another thing that people, are like, oh, but it's just a tool, and artists will just get more tools. They just need to skill up, and it'll be fine. So I really think kind of understanding the politics of that is really important, and realizing that these tools have values embedded in them. I think one historical thing that has been relevant, at least in our discussions, is the history of photography and how technologies are transforming society, but also art, and how artists are always, I think, the vanguards of new technologies. They're the ones playing with these things before really anyone, and really kind of wrestling with the politics and the values embedded in these technologies. So when photography first came around, a lot of painters were very worried that this was the end of art. But it turned out that photography wasn't the end of art. Instead, actually, kind of in many ways, kind of freed painting to do other things. The painter's like, oh, these photographers have like the representation of reality down. Like we can go do abstractionism and impressionism and whatnot. But of course, it's the changing labor market as well. Portraiturists were replaced by portrait photographers in many ways. And of course, generative AI is like a different thing. That's an analogy over 100 years ago. And in particular, photography is a chemical process. And it's just kind of capturing these photons in various ways. And here with generative AI, we have a lot of other people's work and other people's artistic and creative agency embedded in these systems. And we have to wrestle with that and wrestle with the fact that there's ambiguities in how these things are represented and whose data is here, and what are those cycles that are going to be perpetuated and enacted through the use of these technologies. So I think that's just kind of important. And then one last historical analogy I'll kind of end with is this idea of like Luddites. And there's a Wired article 3 days ago saying that everyone now is a Luddite. This, for those who don't know, these are these folks who, when the loom was coming out, these are weavers who were like, oh, hell no. And then they went around and smashed looms. And now kind of synonymously, it's people who don't really like technology. But now with these technologies, and a lot of artists and designers and illustrators are really upset by this, and rightfully so. So there's this kind of upswing in this kind of thinking. And I think it's important to look back at that history, because the Luddites, they actually weren't indiscriminate in what looms they were smashing. They actually were doing, it was called machinery hurtful to the commonality. With the idea that they weren't going to everyone. They were actually targeting specific factories, specific warehouses, where the owners of the looms were engaging in kind of sketchy practices, like not paying people very well or putting the people in kind of unsafe environments and kind of disregarding kind of public interest in various ways. So I just kind of think about this kind of modern Luddite nature, like how do we kind of smash the looms that are kind of sketchy, and the ones that are actually good kind of be like, okay, these are the potentials for that. So I think it's kind of both a little bit, and the ambiguity is the tension between them that we need to figure out.
All right, okay. I was expecting you to use the keyword at least once, and you did 3 times, so that's great. Thank you for that. I like it, but I'm going to get back to it because I think like staying 50-50 is helping us, but not helping us that much. So I want to kind of like extract more from you later, but I'll listen to Alex first.
Well, I think I'd point the question maybe more towards the output that these systems potentially make as well, because I've seen a lot of questions come up if these systems are actually creative, and what does that mean? Is it similar to the way that we're creative in some way? And if so, like, do the methodologies that fuel creativity also apply to these systems? Through my work with them, I'm quite surprised often sometimes the outputs I get. There's a lot of interesting surprise, and I also feel like I'm able to steer things in the direction that is parallel with how I would have made something, or like goes with my humor or my style, but is different enough that it amplifies what I'm trying to do. And I think being ambiguous in that way is helpful. But as mentioned before, being ambiguous in that way, if you're trying to do science or math or something like that, with particular systems, can be harmful. And we're saying like AI is like a thing, right? It's many different systems doing many different things and many different types of software. Some are very specific to particular things, like the protein folding, for example. Can't be ambiguous in there. But yeah, and sort of language and that sort of thing, there's a lot more in that system. So I guess that's the other thing I'd leave off with is AI as a term is ambiguous because it's just many, many different things. Some machine learning, some deep learning, some statistical math, all over the place. So, yeah.
Would you say you use it to produce kind of an estrangement at the beginning of a process? Something that surprises you that then you have to collaborate with or respond to?
Yeah, I think if I get something out that's too close to actually what I want, then it's not as interesting to me if I'm like have a little bit of surprise in there. So I do kind of tune things, I feel like, to add a bit of that into the system.
Yeah, what I'm hearing from you is that, I try to kind of like, formulate the question that way, which is you expect something unexpected to kind of emerge, right? Which is again about the emergence of the idea, and then which triggers probably another idea, and then you feed back to the system, and so on and so forth. I'm going to spend maybe 1 minute each because I took some notes. Everybody says some interesting things. I'm supposed to go to question 2, but I'll steal 3 minutes here, with your permission. What was interesting to me was, between the debate of calling AI tool versus agent, you said it hallucinates.
It's the word that's used around
Yes,
it,
everybody
right?
uses that. And to me, for instance, if I'm thinking about hallucinating, this is me, I would call it maybe an agent, right?
Yeah, but this is where I think that we are anthropomorphizing,
Yes,
right?
exactly.
And what it does is produces outputs that are probabilistic and that are not thought by it. So therefore, I don't think I wouldn't anthropomorphize it, even though I use the word hallucinate, because I actually find poetry in that is useful for me, because I'm interested in producing, at least in this work, something that feels like a memory. So, okay.
That's great. That answers my question. Anybody who wants to take on that same question, or?
There's actually a lot of parallels in things like social robotics, or things that move, or that we look at ourselves. We anthropomorphize a lot of stuff around us, and part of it comes from just us trying to understand what's happening in terms that we know. But there's obviously dangers in that, because you can ascribe more meaning or agency to a thing by those sorts of assumptions. So it's helpful in one way and definitely harmful in another.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the anthropomorphization, and it can, again, it's like metaphors, and sometimes it can be delightful, and I want to acknowledge that. I think just kind of my position in the work that I've done is just kind of seeing the harms and the consequences that come with anthropomorphization. So for example, not only does it mean that artists, human artists who are involved in the creation, that the credit and responsibility is undermined for them. But we've also seen anthropomorphization going the other way, where basically it's used to deflect accountability and responsibility for human. Oh, it's not my fault. The AI was hallucinating. It was doing some crazy stuff, And we've seen this time and time again. So I think, obviously these are all kind of metaphors, but I always just get really peeved by the anthropomorphic language a little bit. And the hallucinations, would love another word for those. I find them delightful as well. And we've found in various of our creative work that it's that serendipity that it induces is breathtaking and so generative and inspiring. And so how do we kind of lean into that element of that without kind of getting tripped up in some of these more like nominative traps?
Great. I'll get back to you both on that the word hallucination, because I've been hearing it a lot, and but I'm not allowed to speak. I'm only allowed to ask questions, which is great actually. It's a good position to have. Wonderful. I'm really enjoying this. So we covered emergence plus ambiguity, right? So the second question is about embodiment. I think I'm having a problem. I've been having problems with computers for a while. I love them. I use them. I have to use them. My job title starts with computer, so I have to do something about it anyway on a daily basis. But embodiment is the only way to experience the world. Like my sensory, inputs and outputs, if I can call, both say sensory and input and output in the same sentence, is a little weird. But I'll do that. So art and design, they create tangible experiences, right? We hear them, we see them, we touch them. It's deeply embodied. Like this is how I think. I have paper and I'm writing on it, right? So like I use my body. So it's like super embodied. And do you think while working with, this was the question that people ask for with computers for 50 years, right? So now we're asking it with AI. Do you think we have achieved a holistic sensory interaction with the current, AI systems? Or if we are missing anything, what could fill that gap?
And you want to start with me again?
I'm going to start with you again.
I don't know if I can speak about it generally, really. And this is where, I don't have the 7-decade history of AI to work with, to know exactly where we were meant to go, or whoever started inventing it wanted to go. But and as long as we're working with images, of course, it's a two-dimensional proposition on one end. But for me, at least in the project that we did, I thought that we were able to produce affect on a variety of levels that together produces something that is more than a two-dimensional image moving in time. And so that could also be something that I would say, of basically the way in which exhibitions can work, which is like they are, in fact, a spatial experience in time, and we were able to work with a soundscape. So there is no question that when you're in that kind of environment, your experience of it is sensory in more than one or more than two dimensions that we start off with on the screen.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Let's make a plot twist and go with Alex this time.
Oh boy. I mean, I would once again shift to the output of systems and embodiment, right?
Yeah.
Given my backgrounds in robotics, among other things, I guess embodiment to me means like being able to interface and interact with the world and modify it. Right now at the museum, actually continuously, there's going to be a plotting robot drawing AI images that are going to be put down a long hallway, and there's going to be artwork made over time. So to me, that's a certain type of physicalization of the digital, right? But that could have been done also with say a generative image generator. So it didn't need to necessarily be AI either. I also think it's interesting, like how the most successful systems we're seeing are these deep learning ones, which are like, okay, let's throw as much data at them as we can, and that seems to be effective, which to me is quite interesting in the way of it, like embodying the world, but also the fact that things kind of started with creative outputs. We started with images and text and sound and that sort of thing. I feel like when people imagine what the AI would be in the future, they thought it'd be like just all math or all science that these systems were doing, but they're actually doing creative things, which to me, speaks something about the world and the way that it's perceiving things. Perceiving, again, anthropomorphizing.
Yeah. Ziv?
Yeah, so I think, and it's kind of going, I think it all circles back. And when you think about this kind of tool, and as it kind of emerges, we have these kind of distinct affordances. And I think art done well, and when, viewers and consumers and also the artists kind of have a meaningful interaction with it, kind of really occurs when the artistic tool, when those affordances are really being kind of activated. And I think, to be honest, we are still kind of learning the affordances of these tools, and we see awesome AR. I think there's great examples here of people really understanding those affordances and leaning in and making something that sparks delight and that sparks an experience that is quite nice. And then we see other things like the kind of various outputs of Midjourney, these things that's like, okay, this doesn't do anything inside of me, and I think that's where we don't kind of have this. So as we kind of unfold and learn about the affordances, I think that will be the key way we make that connection. And I think right now we have so far to go. Right now, especially for generative AI, the main way you interact with it is you type in a text and you get something back. You're basically yelling at a black box. That's kind of lame in a sense, what are the kind of affordances of that, And with that, thinking about what are, other ways to kind of embed meaningful human control into these systems to make them much more like, for example, like a violin, right? When a violin player, there's all these, causal inputs. They have this whole kind of space, and they have this brilliant notion in their head of how inputs map to outputs, and then they can kind of really exert and embed their artistic intention into the outputs. And with generative AI, where you're just yelling at a black box, that gets a little slipperier. So how do we kind of embed this meaningful human control into these systems? I think that's where we'll get the magic and these kind of interactions that kind of hit on all these channels a little bit.
I love the fact that actually you're kind of like making me extend the question yet again. But I think it's super useful because this is a question that I hear from a lot of people. And I'll reformulate it a little bit, right? So, okay, using the computers, let's say we are modeling something, we are going to make an object, design an object, or paint something, or we are going to create a text, right? So our way of interaction with the computer was sit in front of it, type, use the mouse, or let's say build a robotic system, right? Kind of like the motion pattern, G code, whatever you want to say. So most of that process is now automated, right? So that's the surprise, and it's like super fast. Let's say image making. You don't have, well, you can make a collage, but then you can create, versions of that. You can generate a text by just asking. That's the, scary and mind-blowing thing for people. And we saw actually this has been cooking for a while, right? But now it's massively kind of democratized. Like anybody almost can access those. So what has changed is obvious on the generative side. What hasn't changed it, we are still sitting in front of the computer, still typing and still using the mouse in a way, or using our voice. But so the question is, yes, no, there are a couple of things. So, but I wanna push you a little further, right? Okay, what is the case in which you have this crazy interaction with the computer and it generates something? What other ways of interaction could you kind of like envision looking into the future? We're gonna start with you because.
Yeah, I did a project. I make no, statements about the accuracy of any of these sensors that I used, but I used gaze detection and EEG with StyleGAN. I think there's a video of it somewhere, where it would generate images and show them to me on a screen, and it would get this biofeedback as I was looking at a grid of them. Yeah. And then as the algorithm determined which might be more interesting for me, it went down that direction in the latent space. So then it started with a lot of images that were different, then it started narrowing it down more and more and more until one final image came through. Again, I make no statements about the accuracy of these systems. The gaze worked really well as well, but EEG, as you know, is noisy. But just the fact that something, even if it was just gaze itself, like as I was looking through, I didn't have to touch anything or even like get in there. So it did, like I can imagine like kind of laying in a hammock and just kind of making art by looking at a screen, which to me is kind of interesting and absurd. But I think these sort of feedback mechanisms that are going to take data from ourselves and incorporate them into the output and somehow create a feedback loop is both interesting and a little
terrifying.
I really love it because it's a kind of inverse cloud gazing, right? So instead of kind of like looking at the clouds, you project clouds in a way with your gaze and look. I love that.
But these kinds of like low-grade AIs are all over the place, right? So this is where now you can go through a ticket check at the airport because the AI has read your face, and indeed it is you. They have enough information about you to let you go through. I mean, that's the other side of this, right? Like it doesn't make anything. It just is part of a larger sort of surveillance system.
Yep.
Just as the gaze capturing is part of, figuring out where we're spending money and attention. So, and it's used to ensure we spend more of it.
Yeah, and that just scares me. I'm imagining these like futures where you're like scrolling Instagram and like there's all these like AI generated ads like personalized for you, and it like evolves based on like what you like look at, and then the second you click it, it can just like 3D print it and like send it to you on the fly.
Sounds like the next J.G. Ballard novel, which I'm sure could be written by ChatGPT.
There you go. We're entering a weird world. One other thing just to kind of throw in the pot there, we were giving a talk earlier this week, and this whole idea of kind of like art in the age of algorithmic reproduction. So, Walter Benjamin talking about like mechanical reproduction and how that really challenged a lot of the ways we think about art when, art can just be kind of mechanically reproduced. How does that affect like the aura of art, And now when we have this kind of ability for these massive possibility spaces to kind of explore this, how does that change how we think about art? And Kate Compton has this really nice idea. It's called the kind of 10,000 bowls of oatmeal, where if you have a bowl of oatmeal, is that like unique compared to another bowl of oatmeal, or is they all kind of like the same a little bit? So when you get the kind of outputs of these things, you're kind of thinking about it's so-called liquid art. So it's no longer a single artifact, a single bowl of oatmeal, but now it's kind of the space of all bowls of oatmeal, which in some meaningful sense are all kind of like the same. So it's no longer like an artifact that is like the piece of art, but it's a space
singular
now.
Yeah.
Exactly, and so that's interesting, and I don't really know what to do with that, but I think these technologies kind of open up this kind of liquidity of art, which is kind of cool. I don't know.
Wonderful. I got lots of ideas about embodiment and plus interaction. I like that we start with one keyword, then there's a secondary one to back it up. I'm gonna keep those for the next thing, so that's great. let's look at the history, to kind of start closing it. Not closing it yet, but start closing it. So one thing that's happening is this thing exploded within the last couple of years, generative AI, right? Larger portion of the population, most of the people are not aware, this thing has been going on around 7 decades. Depending on, which date you take as the first thing, I'm taking like Turing's paper from 42. The dates might change, 52, sorry. The duration might change. And there are a lot of promises. Right, so AI is going to do that. AI is going to replace jobs, job replacement, things about security, things about kind of like, let's say, intellectual property, and so on and so forth. And when people start using these tools, there also has been an explosion. Of course, everybody talked about ChatGPT. It took, let's say, 4 days to, for it to reach like 1 million users and so on and so forth. So there's always like a big explosion, and then there's this like the bubble bursts and it goes down. We're gonna see if this is a bubble or not. So usually I've been playing the role within an environment to push on the brakes, right? So instead of pushing on the gas, I'm like, okay, take this, use it, and so on. I try to critically approach all tools, use them, learn them, but also not trust them that much. And everywhere, usually people close with, okay, what is the next thing that AI is going to do, and so on. That's the question. So I'm going to ask, what is AI not going to do? What it won't be able to do? Is there an AI promise that will remain unfulfilled?
I mean, this is where you're looking at me, so I'm
Please.
figuring, yeah. I got your gaze. So, I mean, I'm hoping, we don't go to Westworld with it. And I don't, as I said, I don't know really the full history of this development. So I wonder, it's clear with Turing that what we needed from AI is to solve really complex computational problems. But if our hope is that it replaces thinking, I would prefer not to. So that's sort of for me, the way that this tool operates right now, certainly in the realm in which I use it, not for solving problems that are tangible and concrete, but to speak through it about other things. I do find it, and we've already mentioned this, I do find it a kind of a nostalgic tool. Maybe this goes back to the bowl, right? That in a way, it can only work with what, certainly the large language models, and insofar as those are used to produce image outputs, it can only work with what already exists to produce probability out of it, or probable sort of outcomes out of it. That means it produces all of the biases and gaps that archive has produced. So if in architecture, for example, that archive is mostly made up of works by white male European architects, that's what it has in it. And so we have to figure out how not to have it perpetuate what's already in it, but actually question it. I don't know if that answers your what.
It does.
But that's
we are getting there. I think this was a great one. Thank you. Ziv?
Yeah, so, and you can imagine so many different futures, kind of where we go from here and how these technologies are evolving. But I think, the opportunity here is and new technologies always do this, is kind of think about where does the human stop and the machine begin. And as these tools are able to do these kind of human-like things, that's, I think, an awesome opportunity for us to really think about what it means to kind of be human. And a lot of, at least my own work, and I think work here, is really talking about how there's always a human in the loop somewhere. Human fingerprints are kind of everywhere. And I believe that will remain to be true. And I think the kind of hope there is that generative AI can kind of be like an ontological wrecking ball, and it can kind of like shake things up in a very interesting way to kind of rethink what it means to kind of be a human in this time. And so, people talk about like post-humanism, and beyond just kind of the human. And there's maybe two branches of this. There's kind of this transhumanist thing where AI and technology kind of augments the human, kind of makes us better, more powerful, more interesting, versus more kind of critical or philosophical posthumanism, which is about decentering the human and kind of realizing our position in a more than human world. And I think this is a super interesting opportunity for generative AI to shake up these kind of very anthropocentric ontologies that are very implicit in science and design and all these things, and kind of help us change and shift our perspective a little bit and kind of think about kind of who we are in this world. We talk about metaphors for these tools, a good one, I like it, but I'll leave you with another one, which is that AI is like putting on a jetpack and a blindfold. You're going really, really, really fast, but you don't know really kind of where you're going a little bit, And I think that will remain to be true. So I think in the face of that, the question is, okay, how do we take off the blindfold and learn again to see?
I love that. Can I add one more?
Please.
A couple of yours. It's a generalist, but he's only a baby. So a baby
like
who's
that.
trying to do everything at once.
Totally.
If we go back to the unfold.
It's a he.
It's a probably if he's not able to do anything like me, it's a he.
Well, if there's anything I know from the history of technology is trying to predict the future of technology is pretty hard to do, if not impossible. So also trying to predict the negative of what's happening, I think, is kind of also impossible. If you look back to what we thought we would have now and what people thought like economies would be and that sort of thing, it's quite different from what the predictions were. So yeah, I think that's really the thing to keep in mind is that I don't think anyone can say for certain there's something AI can't do or like just science can't do or like humans can't do eventually. So yeah, trying to predict that is hard, but putting up, driving things in a certain way towards the future, I think is the way to go.
All right. Thanks. I'll go back to the he, because that was a good point. I think that this needs to be pretty discussed as well, because we are talking about AI. Let me call it they. And in some languages, we don't have the separation for he and she. We just call o, for instance, in my language. And sometimes I snap, as I did a second ago. So I hope you will forgive me for that. And I will call AI they after this point. And all my writing is usually s/he, so that comes to be she. So is that okay? Works?
Okay.
All right. That's gonna be another discussion between us then. All right. So this was an amazing discussion for me. What we did is we covered three things. The first one was emergence plus ambiguity. The second one was embodiment, and then we talked about interaction. And the third one was the expectations. And for expectations, instead of asking what's going to happen, I wanted to learn what is not really going to happen. So that was important for me. So what I learned is, the last thing I learned for sure, the one thing I think we kept discussing was anthropomorphization. Yes, no, that's great. Another language problem. Because interestingly, everything we try to understand, we project ourselves onto them, and we kind of learn from them. And same thing goes for AI. I think one problem we are having we are embodied creatures. That's why I wanted to highlight that. And AI doesn't have a clear form yet. And I think there will be some plans for that, but we don't know what they're going to become. The second thing that I learned is, and I kind of appreciate, which is the use of the word nostalgic. And there's a big dilemma there, and that's kind of highlighting how AI is actually an old technology. So whatever it's generating, it's actually a blend of all the data set that's been fed into it. All the data that we're feeding has happened already in the past, right? So what I'm understanding is there's a dilemma looking into the future, trying to advance things. Actually, we are kind of getting very rooted in the past, right? Although it's hallucinating, although it's showing us new patterns, all the patterns are in the past. How can you rely on something that is so rooted in the past? Will be a question that's remaining with me. With that, we have time to go. We really wanted to spare this time. and we would like to open the floor for questions. One thing that's crucial is that we will expect you to walk into the mics or ask for a mic. Yeah, if you have any questions for anybody here, please shoot it.
Thank you.
Awesome. So, Ziv, yeah, brought up an interesting metaphor of like the camera and then relieving art in some ways of the burden of objective reality. And it took something like the camera to open that up because it hadn't opened up in the time before that. And like, I think it's interesting to ask like what AI can do, can't do, should do, how we might interact with it. But I'm curious if you can, or have thought about or can describe the nature of the burden that we currently hold in the way that like art was tied a little too much to objective reality. If we can understand like the nature of the burden that we currently hold, that AI might allow us to suddenly not hold any further.
Wow, that's a really interesting framing. I love this question. I think that, yeah, I think every like art form kind of wrestle, and I'd love to hear what you guys all think about this as well, but I think every art form wrestles with the kind of zeitgeist of its time. And so right now, I think AI, people are really kind of exploring questions of the attention economy, which we talked about, and corporate control and automation in kind of various ways. And so I think those are the kind of like big things in the room that people are kind of wrestling with. And I hope that as AI, becomes a player on the scene, that people will kind of be able to kind of have a language to express and counteract and kind of engage with those kind of things. One kind of layer, and this is just kind of working with the lawyers and kind of over at Harvard Law School, like how kind of brittle the U.S. kind of legal system is, especially with kind of fair use as it's defined. And I think the at least the American kind of version of law, and in kind of the art world as well, kind of really puts a lot of emphasis on the kind of individual creator. And this kind of the artist, and they do everything. But oftentimes there's massive teams, and everyone's kind of doing their own thing. And AI, I think, really makes us realize how distributed creation and ownership really is. And so as our legal system, for example, really struggles to kind of catch up with how distributed these technologies are, maybe that's like an awesome opportunity for us to kind of rethink these very individualistic kind of models that exist in the legal, in the art world.
I love that answer. So I've certainly been thinking about it and writing about it. And so the idea that we might get unburdened from individual genius creative and embrace something much more distributed and ambiguous.
Check.
Sounds great to me as a kind of a hopeful kind of view of it.
Please.
So I'm sort of keying in at a bunch of the things that went on. For example, it seems that the four of you all view ChatGPT or whatever these systems are as a tool, not a thinking being or something. And then I believe I read an article recently that said one of them, I think, actually passed the Turing test, or like 50% or 60% of them. So I realize the question of is it thinking is really much too high level, but coming back to your discussion of the violin, and especially your discussion of that it's based on the past, and what if the AI could actually learn to you said something like this, contradict our biases. Like if we had a system that somehow we trained up and it started questioning what it was given.
It became political. I love that.
Maybe, but so that is that then more of a thinking object, and I don't know if the distinct, and also I sort of the other way I'm thinking is that I feel like in art might be the first place where we would observe this, that you might say, actually, this AI is perhaps intelligent and doing something. And along the lines with that is like, so maybe in terms of embodiment is what you need to do is put the AI into a robot that then just walks around and explores its environment and learns on its own instead of being fed stuff. So there's a lot in there, I apologize, but it's been fascinating.
I can quickly jump in. Actually, that happened, right? So AI research, early in the days, they realized, again, 40 years ago, that you cannot really inject the knowledge, they turn to the models which made the robots to learn from their environments. So there are papers on actually Roomba is a product of that. The vacuum cleaner that you have, that's one. The second thing is, I don't want to steal too much time from the panelists, but ChatGPT is the linguistic model is a statistical model which puts words, word by word, just by statistical, what comes next kind of thing. So that there is, if you think humans are thinking that way, it's a thinking. But if humans are not thinking that way, it's not really thinking.
But in a different conversation, so this may or may not, that I had about this, we were talking about ChatGPT being able to footnote something and then asked, did it really find the footnote? And it said yes, but it was a hallucinated footnote. All right, it doesn't know that it hallucinated it. It is part of its probability.
Perhaps that's the thinking when it hallucinates, is when it's actually being creative. I also thought that they had stopped it from hallucinating recently, but.
Oh, but I don't think they can. I mean, the way that it operates is through a multidimensional model of things where, like it plots a course through that. So that the only way it works is through hallucinating.
There could be a lot more answers to that. Thank you so much. I'm a historian of art. I'll restrain myself, but I want to provoke you all to think about artists' use of technologies to reveal, to pull the veil away, right? We can talk about glitch. I'd rather we talk about glitch than hallucination, right? Even to say lie or, fake is to impute an intention to the algorithm. So let's talk about glitch. There's a body of glitch art. I also want to offer my personal history, not my personal, but my favorite history is the derivation of the phrase that is now everywhere was actually a political maneuver to keep Norbert Wiener's cybernetics from owning everything, right? It was a big tent proposed for the summer school, in 1956. Yeah, to keep the camps from coalescing around a cybernetic model. And it was never accurate. They had no idea what intelligence meant then. It's always been a problem of bias, of white supremacy, of exclusionary testing. I mean, the whole shebang, right? So we should do our best as discourse workers to combat the name and the anthropomorphism. But back to art and its role, I agree with the general tenet that in the creative fields, we have a huge opportunity to educate the general public away from like crappy surrealism and into the glitch, which is where the operation of these systems can be understood, can be revealed, and can be a source for creative action. So I'd love to hear your thoughts about all that.
Awesome question.
Love it.
I mean, it's sort of, I don't know that I have an answer. I totally, for me, this is like, yes, I totally agree and love the question. I mean, I think, but I can't sort of come up with something on the spot that would be like a appropriate rethinking of AI really super quickly. But I love the idea that we have to actually rename what this is, first of all. And then that one of the things that for me at least is a motivation is to also reveal how it works and what it derives its material from, why we have it, and with it, other things that it can actually enable us to be discussed now in a new way, right? So its computational capacity is interesting for that reason, because it can go through archives so much faster than we can, and then we can figure out what we have to say about them. That to me is exciting as a prospect, as a terrain.
Totally. Yeah, and just to kind of build on that, and I think thank you so much for bringing in this like the Dartmouth workshop and that kind of that history there, because from the beginning we're kind of baked in with this kind of fetishization of like human intelligence, which we're still kind of like wrestling with today. And even when we had this paper, a lot of people didn't really want to use the term AI. If we're going to like write this thing, kind of thinking more carefully about that. So for example, Memo Atkin, who's an AI artist for many years now, he actually prefers the term data-driven methods because it's a little more like honest. And then you're kind of wrestling with the politics of data instead of the politics of intelligence,
Yeah.
which is a very different kind of, and then it's a little more honest in that way. So I think, yeah, thinking about what are these alternative ways to talk about this, what are these metaphors, what are these terms, I think it's a really exciting thing to do. We ultimately went with generative AI because for just saying something that people would understand, and that was like a sacrifice we made, but maybe it's time to kind of reopen that as we kind of see how those terms do harm and do work. And then also just one thing on the glitch is, I will just say personally, and you're talking about GANs as well, I think like 2018, 2019, that was like the golden era of like generative AI in many ways, like because it was so like glitchy and gorgeous and weird and like deep in that uncanny valley. Now it's like so smooth and plastic and like commodified. And I think we're really like on the downswing of that a little bit. So it kind of like missed the days where it had this like gorgeous textured aesthetic that we don't really have anymore.
Actually, I'm gonna echo that because especially Alex's presentation, the engagement from the audience was amazing because generative AI wasn't working, as good. It was like plunge, plunge, plunge. Yeah. So if you try to, which is how it works, right? Usually. But the problem is like if you try to use the newer models, it just does it like so clean. There's no need for plunge anymore. So I think that glitch is a little disappearing, and I think it's a little worrisome. I agree.
It's been a pleasure to listen to all of you speculate on how these new technologies, this new tool, this new agent, might impact the production, the creation of art and artifacts. I'm curious whether you could do the same speculation on how these new technologies might impact the perception of art. How will it change the way we see things when we're contemplating not a single bowl of oatmeal, but millions of them, all of which are identical?
Perception of art.
Great question.
Yeah. So, we've done, a lot of my work is on like misinformation and fake news on social media. So thinking about the algorithms that really mediate our lives in many ways now. And what I think we're going to start to see these feedback loops of aesthetics where, in a sense, content producers are essentially trying to kind of understand what the algorithms that surface and populate content will, bring to the top and kind of design things that are kind of in line with that. And as art has curation and this kind of curatorial layer is so important to that, this kind of folk notion of what the algorithms will upvote and what is sensational and what is shareable becomes much more salient. Then, in turn, the algorithms are trying to predict what gets a lot of engagement. So there's this kind of co-evolution of even in the architectural space of style, where certain style, it's the Zaha Hadid thing, the algorithm predicts that will go well. And then people are like, the algorithm seems to be predicting Zaha, so let's do more of that. So you get these kind of perpetuations of a homogenization of content. So I think there's a real danger that we will really get a lot of convergence on aesthetics because of the kind of algorithmic mediation of social media and the ways we kind of interface with a lot of this digital art. And I think that's also true, I think it was mentioned before, this kind of flywheel where the images created today will be the training data potentially of the future. So all those biases, all those problems, all those homogenized styles are just going to get fed back in, and we're just going to get kind of further along that way. So we have some work, and there's really interesting stuff on how do you actually embed diversity into that and kind of open that up a little bit instead of having it be a centralizing force, but I think it's a huge challenge.
I mean, your question made me also think about, do we train ourselves to see the generic bowl in every bowl, right? Because now we know that this material is fed elsewhere and it produces outputs of a certain kind. And generic bowl just sounds a lot less delightful than a specific bowl.
Alex, I'm interested in hearing you too for this question about maybe perception of your art, because you had various pieces which were kind of like using maybe different techniques and speaking to different perceptions.
Well, yeah, certainly don't look at the arguments on social media for these things. Those degrade quickly into what is and is not art, which is sort of the most boring question, I suppose, that can come from this. I think what is good art is really the question. And what do we want from art? What do we want from technology? What at the end of the day do as humankind want from these things? And if we're going in the direction away from that? Is that an evolution of ourselves, like things have evolved in the past, or are we truly getting away from what's meaningful? I think those are really the questions to ask. Because yeah, some of my work hits people, really strongly, and other people have a very strong reaction against it. Sometimes just because of the fact it was made by AI, or just because of the fact a robot carved that marble, for instance. So yeah, I think there's perception into like how much of the human hand was in it, how hard was it to make,
Back to the aura. Yeah.
Yeah, so like these arguments that again go into other fields of art are coming up here as well.
I'm going to pick one of his words, which he used, while answering. Hit. To me, again, like after experiencing some life-changing events, if it hits me, it's art. That's it. I don't care. I don't care how it's made. I don't care who made it. It's just giving me, if I'm experiencing something, that's my perception. I'll just take it that way. Please.
Okay, really? Sorry, I was going to ask a different question, but if you went to a concert and you heard a symphony orchestra play, and then later you found out that the entire piece was composed by an AI and not a human, would that make you feel differently?
Are you asking me or?
Yeah.
There was an entire ad campaign in the 20s against canned music and robots ruining music from live theater music. And there was all this like idea that it would actually ruin the feeling. Like if you went to a movie and it wasn't real music, you wouldn't feel anything for it. And I don't think that's the case that we're hearing recorded music. I think, if it moves you or not, does it matter who or what made it? I think that's a personal thing. And I guess the question is, do you need to be told, or should you be told, or does this need to be disclosed, or like what in that arrangement makes sense? Same things came out when the drum machine came out. There's a big pushback from drummers and things of that sort. But now this is a tool that's used in people's creative processes. So yeah, it's a great question. I think it's quite individual to people as well.
And just with that too, I think like there's this notion where maybe the first time you hear the AI concert, you're like, wow, like amazing. But then after like the third, you're like, okay, like there's this kind of derivativeness. And I think that's where the norms within artist communities, and artists always have, they have the nose for, okay, is this person doing something derivative, or is there actually something interesting here? And I think we are still figuring that out with generative AI, where it's, what is actually interesting stuff? And maybe that first concert is like pretty interesting, and then after a while we're like, okay, what are we really doing here? So I think as the norms and cultures within art communities really grapple with this and start to understand what is derivative and what is like interesting, new, epic stuff, that's, I think, where rubber will hit the road a little bit.
Sorry, could I just pipe in one thing about what you were saying about movie music? Because in fact, much of what you hear is computer generated in the sense that it's synthesized. And I had an experience, I think it was one of the Star Trek movies, with a friend of mine who's a conductor, who immediately could tell, as probably you could as well, when the music was synthesized and when it was a real orchestra. And it was a real orchestra at the most emotionally intense parts. So in fact, we are already experiencing that. And so.
Right. So just I won't ask my original question because this is more interesting, but so this is, you're bringing up some of the older things about, okay, synthesize, or was the orchestra synthesized from a piece of software, or was it live people playing, right? But like when I go to hear a piece of music being played by an orchestra, like what matters to me is that there was a composer who had real life experiences and that motivated them to write this piece of music. Right?
Sure, that's very personal. I think the average everyday person also on the subway or on the treadmill listening to Spotify while they're working out probably would be as satisfied with, say, music synthesized.
Yeah, totally agree. And so I think that's actually fine. I think there's like different classes of art, and but for that specific case, right? Like you are going to not as background music, but to actually hear. Do you guys really think that at some point we'll be like, oh my God, that was the most epic, and I don't even care who wrote it, because I kind of don't think so, but.
Depends on what we are hearing, right? So because you are kind of like, what is the art form for you is the thinking behind the music. for some people, music is music, and they go to the concert to experience the performance. But you're kind of like thinking about at the back of your head, you're thinking about the composer and the experiences. I think they are both valid. So I don't think there's a wrong or right there. So I think like both connect back to like something there, right? Which is, I'm like, compute your gut, AI. That's very hard.
Okay, thanks.
There's one more, I guess. We have 1 minute left, so let's go.
Well, actually, my question is kind of related to what he was saying.
Sorry, we can't hear you.
Actually, my question was kind of related to what he was saying.
Okay.
And it's more of a personal experience. I remember listening to a song, and as I was listening to it, I felt like I had decade old back pain. I felt like my shoes were not working anymore. I felt a discomfort, and I felt bad about something. And the song was just talking about a strap breaking. And what I wanted to know is that have you ever looked at AI art or listened to something that AI has come out with and felt the soul of the piece of art?
I think that, the question is, have you ever bumped into an artwork which was soulful for you, which, AI was able to generate something that deeply affected you? Is that the question we're dealing with? Yeah.
I mean, I like the thing we made, which in which we use the AI to generate it, but with a lot of kind of editing and pulling levers and reorganizing the way that it would be trained on images and the way in which it would interpolate them. So for me, what was maybe surprising, but also optimistic, is that we managed, in my view, for my sake at least, to produce an affect and an aesthetic experience that I thought could stand on its own.
Any other takers?
Yes.
Yes. With that, actually, please join me. Thank Anna, Alex, and Ziv. That was a good one. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.